Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today I am going to talk about referendums in autocratic states, that is, in states that are not democracies. The reason why I am doing this is, and it's a bit of a paradox, I suppose, the fact that people actually vote in places where the result is a foregone conclusion. But anyway, the reason for doing this is that at the time when we're recording this lecture, Russia is about to go to the polls for the first time since 1993. There's going to be a referendum, so it's called. I would call it a plebiscite for reasons I have outlined in previous lectures. But there's going to be a plebiscite on a new system of government. In fact, the system of government will pretty much stay the same, but the difference is that Vladimir Putin, who's been term limited or was not able to seek another term, will change the system of government so that he can govern until 2036, by which time he will be in his late 80s. So it is a system that they want to change, and then they want to get the approval of the people. Now, what is interesting about that is the fact that they actually vote at all. Now, back in the day when you had the types of dictators like Louis XIV, the Sun King, then he could do anything. He was anointed, he said, by God. But nowadays, all dictators, all autocrats, more or less pay lip service to the idea of democracy. So that is one of the reasons why we want to talk about this particular aspect of the plebiscite. Now, in order to talk about the plebiscite, we also, which is a thing that I have talked about with my colleagues Brendan O'Leary and Ronald Winthrop in an article in Government, in the current issue of Government and Opposition, which I will come back to a little bit later. But before we start talking about the plebiscite, we need to understand the context in which this takes place. Now, there's been a lot of talk recently about the tendency towards introducing more autocratic systems of government. A lot of talk has been about how countries that are democratic gradually become autocratic states. It's sometimes talked about as death by 1,000 cuts. It doesn't happen overnight, but gradually, little by little, countries that are democracies become dictatorships. But what we really need to understand, what is not often talked about in political science, is the anatomy of dictatorship. And to understand the plebiscite within a dictatorship, we need to understand, if you like, the broader context of that particular system of government, the autocratic system of government, which is the polar opposite, if you like, to a democratic system of government. Of course, it's a sliding thing. There are democracies that are more democratic than others. Switzerland is more democratic, perhaps, than Spain, which again are very different from places like Venezuela, which is a dictatorship, but it's not a dictatorship to the same degree as in North Korea. Anyway, to understand this, we need to go back again in history, and it's always good to take as our starting point the genius that was Aristotle. Now, it's not that Aristotle was the only person in the world to write about politics in ancient times, but he was the first one to do that, and he was very sort of particular in the way he was dealing with that. And Aristotle basically says, and this is a distinction that's been used ever since, that there are three types of systems of government. There are democracies, there are aristocracies, and then there are monarchies. Now, these are sort of like the good types, and for each and every good type, there is a bad type. So for a monarchy, then it can become a dictatorship or a tyranny. An aristocracy, which more or less is what we have as representative government, can become an oligarchy, where it's just a number of elites are fighting it out. And a democracy can become, well, democracy for him was actually a negative term, but he could say a constitutional government was one where there was more or less government by referendum all the time. But what we're dealing with here then is the end of the spectrum, which is autocratic, the one which are monarchies or tyrannies. And in an ideal world, says Aristotle, you could have an autocratic leader who is benevolent, who actually thinks of the people first and only himself afterwards. But those systems are very rare. We might have a benevolent despot like Frederick the Great in Prussia, who, if you actually look closely, probably wasn't that benevolent. It was enlightened absolutism, but it was absolutism all the same. Now, those types of leaders, what is it that make it so difficult in some ways to be an autocrat? What is the anatomy of a system of government like that? And throughout history, political scientists have obviously written about this. There's been much more written about democracy than dictatorship. But during the Cold War, there was a classic study, which is the one I have here. It's a very old book, as you can see, Totalitarian and Dictatorship and Autocracy by Karl Friedrich and Zbigniew Brzezinski. That is difficult to pronounce if you're not Polish. And in this particular book, they say, well, there is a fundamental distinction between these two types of government. In a totalitarian system of government, everything is controlled. Not even your thoughts are your own. That is the Orwellian state. Today, we probably only really have that in North Korea. In other places, you're probably able to think, though they would want to shrink the boundaries of that. At times, of course, we might even say that the Chinese system of government has approached that. But nowadays, even in China, there's considerable freedom of speech, or at least you're not controlled all the time, as if in an Orwellian state. So there's a German song that's called Die Gedanken sind frei. The thoughts are free. You're able to think. In a totalitarian system of government, which is rather unique actually for the 20th century, everything is totally controlled. So we had that in Nazism in Germany, we had it under Stalin, and we had it in some states after the Second World War, but possibly not even in places like the Soviet Union in the 70s. Those are autocratic states or autocracies where all power resides in an individual. Now, some people would say that those systems of government are much more efficient because at least you know what to do, you call the shots and so on. Now, the problem with that is that you don't really have any mechanism, a feedback mechanism. So if there's something you don't like, if, for example, a coronavirus breaks out and somebody were to blow a whistle, which happened in December, and say, well, you really ought to wear a face mask, then the system of government, the government will say, well, we've failed, we don't want that to be exposed. So they will probably, in the case of Wuhan, they did, said to this individual, you're not allowed to say that. He was held before a court, he had to apologize publicly and denounce what he had said, and then 2 weeks later he died. So in autocracy, the ability to speak up is severely limited because any kind of criticism will implicitly be a criticism of the leaders of the state, and they don't want to be criticized because they are there, because they are perfect, because they have perfect knowledge about the system of government and the system of administration. So any kind of criticism will be frowned upon, will be discouraged, and anyone who would criticize the government will typically be dealt with and be silenced in a not too subtle way, in an education camp, for example. So that is how it works in a more sort of in a system of government that is autocratic, perhaps even verging towards the totalitarian state. Now, you might think that it's very different. It might be easy to do that because you've got all the power in the world. Now, the difficulty of running an autocratic state is that you don't have total control. You never do. I once did a job in Africa, in Ghana, at the Defense Academy in Ghana. And right next to the Defense Academy, there was a mango grove. Wonderful mango trees. And I asked the commander at the time, why is there a mango grove? Do you grow mangoes? Do you sell these mangoes? And he says, no, we don't. Well, when Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president, i.e. dictator of Ghana, was in power, he needed the support of the military. You always need the support of the leading people. And the commander, the head of the military academy, says he wanted a mango grove. So Kwame Nkrumah gave him that. He said, well, okay, here it is. And typically when you look at dictatorships, you always look at ways in which you can placate other elites. There are always people who are out to get you. In a dictatorship, in an autocratic state, you never have total power. There are always people who are out to get you. There's always maneuvering to become the next leader. In many autocratic states, you actually don't have a very long life expectancy because people will overthrow you in a coup. Even those who are very close to you would want to overthrow you in a coup. But the problem with a dictatorship is that you have to give all these handouts. And all these handouts are kind of corruption. In Venezuela, which is by now an autocratic state, if ever there was one really, Maduro reduced the salaries for doctors, but increased it tenfold for the military. So the people in the military now have an incentive to keep him in power, and that is one of the ways in which you can be successful as an autocrat. You need to be able to selectively pay people who will keep you in power. So in a monarchical, if you like, or tyrannical state, you don't really have, as a leader, total control. You need to find ways in which you can please different people, and you have to identify the people who are the most important ones. And if you're able to do that, you will stay in power. If, however, you just go on with reforms and things like that, and you don't actually pay attention to the possible challenges, then you do have a problem, because they will then gang up on you. They say, well, this is what's in it for me, it's not a lot in it for me. We will overthrow the dictator and find another dictator. So typically, whenever you have dictatorships that break down, we think, oh, well, now the dictatorship has broken down and then it will become a democracy. Now, they might say it will become a democracy, but in most cases, and over 80% of the cases, democracies that break down, or dictatorships that break down, go on to be or form other dictatorships. In most cases, in the former Soviet Union, Ukraine being the only possible odd one out, and of course the Baltic countries, all of them went from being dictatorships under the Soviet Union to becoming new dictatorships in places like Kazakhstan, Belarus, Uzbekistan, and so on. While there were elections and there was a facade of democracy, that facade of democracy is only that. And it is just another power elite that comes in and takes the place of the old elite. The same thing happened when you had elites that were changed into becoming communist states in Yugoslavia, which is seen as a benevolent communist state in the post-war era during the Cold War. Gillian, who was an oppositional, wrote a book called The New Power Elite, where he said, well, it's actually just the same. They have all this talk about communism and brotherly love and so on, but really it is just another power elite. They're behaving just in the same way as they were before. So to understand dictatorship is then to understand how a clever dictator, a good dictator, is able to give selected handouts to people. Also, most dictators, of course, get filthy rich because they try to control things. When you look at the likes of Erdogan today, then he is a very wealthy man because he is able to control things. But the reason why somebody like Erdogan is able to control Turkey, which is not a fully blown dictatorship in the way that North Korea or Venezuela even is, then he's able to do that because he selectively has found out who the other power brokers are, who the ones he needs to keep happy are. Now, in that system of government, you also need to find a way in which you can get popular approval. The problem for the dictator is that you don't want to have too much dissent. You're able to control the people if you control the military and the police. But even that requires an element of finesse, if you like. Now, if things are too bad for the people who are being run the country, if they're actually totally impoverished, it might be able to control them because they find it difficult for them to do much. It requires quite a lot to have an uprising. But the dissent can sometimes seep out, and sometimes it would seem that the government is out of control, and the military and the people who are on the take, really, who are benefiting from the dictatorial system, may see that the system may be about to break down. It might be so much discontent that even the military will say, well, this is not going well. We need to find a new dictator who we can then install in a seemingly democratic way, even if it isn't necessarily democratic. So you always need to find a way in which you can signal that there is control. And one of the things that has happened in, well, basically since the French Revolution, is that even dictators feel they have to do something for the people. They need to please the people. They need to give them selective handouts. That's what the Romans did, but bread and circuses. The circuses were for entertainment. People were being fed, and people weren't upset about it because at least they were being fed and they had entertainment, and so who cares about politics? But in most cases, dictatorships are not able to do that because they are very expensive, because you have to give these handouts to people, and the longer you've been in office, the more handouts you have to give to selected elites who will keep you in power. Now, one of the things that you typically do in a dictatorship is, especially when you come in, especially if you just become the dictator, if you overthrow another dictator, is you then have a plebiscite. You say, well, people actually like me, and I'm actually here because the people want me to be here. There was a Mexican dictator in the 1870s who said, well, just elect me once and then I'll take care of it. The same happened with Baby Doc Duvalier, who was the dictator of that was the first one. The father was Papa Doc Duvalier, and there was Baby Doc Duvalier, who was the son. And Baby Doc Duvalier in Haiti said, well, just elect me once, and we'll have a plebiscite of whether I should have power forever. And if you vote for that, then you'll be in safe hands, because I know how to take care of this particular state. Now, what is interesting about many of these dictators, in fact, almost all of them, is that they have plebiscites, or they call them referendums, and Putin is now having one too, so we can put him into that category. Now, if we look at the sort of who is who of the most notorious dictators since the French Revolution, then they have pretty much all been characterized by the fact that they've held plebiscites. Napoleon Bonaparte, had several plebiscites, one to cement his control of power, another one to make him emperor for life, another one to establish a hereditary imperial state. When just before Waterloo, when he'd come back, he had a referendum on a new constitution, which actually passed. Then in the 1850s, his nephew, Louis Bonaparte, also had, or the Napoleon III, also had plebiscites to solidify his time in power. Mussolini held a referendum in 1929. Adolf Hitler had referendums in 1933. And if we then sort of go further up in history, we've had referendums in Iran. Ayatollah Khomeini had referendums. Franco in Spain had referendums. Ceausescu in Romania. The list basically goes on. Now, the idea of these plebiscites is sometimes a little bit odd. When the French had left Vietnam and the Americans wanted to maintain the system of an anti-communist system in power, they organized, with the help of the Vietnamese, a referendum, but they didn't really do the homework particularly well. So one of the things that they found out afterwards was that the turnout rate had been higher than there were actually voters, and it was a bit of a fraud. Now, it typically is in these cases. When 3 weeks before the invasion of Iraq, Saddam Hussein organized a referendum, basically also to consolidate power and to show that there was unity in the nation. In that referendum, there was 100% turnout and 100% support for Saddam Hussein. So all the Kurds, all the Shias, all the Sunnis, we're asked to believe, voted for Saddam Hussein. Now, it seems very obvious when you look at these referendums that they've got to be rigged in some way. I have a story that or an anecdote from South Ossetia, which is now officially part of Georgia in former Soviet Union, but South Ossetia really wants to secede. They've had several wars, and in the early 1990s they had declared independence, and there was a referendum on whether they should become independent. So a group from the OSCE were travelling there, the OSCE, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, to validate or just figure out what was going on. They go to a place, one of them needs to go to the toilet. He goes to the toilet, he realizes there's no toilet paper there. Instead, there's a whole stack of ballot papers. Most of the ballot papers are ticked with da, which is Russian for yes. He comes down and says, well, this is evidence of fraud. And the interpreter says, well, I guess they just printed too many. That's how we always do it. You can't have more than 100%, so they have to get rid of some of them. And it was sort of like blatant for the interpreter who'd grown up in the Soviet system that, of course, the results of any kind of democratic, in inverted commas, exercise is fraudulent. It goes back to what Joseph Stalin, of course a native of those parts, once said, in an election, or indeed in a referendum, what matters is not so much who votes, but who counts the votes. So there's that sort of fraudulent element of it. In Nazi Germany, even people who were interned in concentration camps were asked to vote for Hitler. We have wonderful records of, terrifying records really, of the machinery there. And there was a head of one of these internment camps was sacked because he only managed to get 80% of people interned in the camps to vote for Adolf Hitler. So those people who were political prisoners were expected to vote for Adolf Hitler. And why would they vote for him? Well, they were there, they were completely indoctrinated, and you really sort of forcing people to have the same opinion. So one of the things that characterize referendums is that it is a way of eliminating dissent. It is a way of saying that there is no dissent in these countries. Now, if you look around the world and you then look at these plebiscites, the likes of which Putin is about to hold one in Russia, then you say, what is the point? What is it? You've got control over the system, you control over the secret police. Why would you want to do that? Well, it is very much a signifier of, to use a literary term, it's a signifier of unity. So whenever you have referendums, typically on these sorts of issues, they're not really about issues. Like one of the substantial issues is that Putin can stay in power. But it is finding ways in which you can show that there is unity in the country over certain things. We'll just come back to that just in a little while. One of the things we showed in our article here in Government and Opposition, which is also shown, if I may, in my own book, the Referendum and Other Essays on Constitutional Politics, is that referendums in dictatorships tend to take place in countries that are disunited ethnically. If you have a country that is homogeneous, then you don't really need to show that level of unity. But if you take a place like Russia, then Russia, yes, there are Russians, but there are also people who are Tatars, there are people who are of a number of ethnic minorities, there are people who have different points of view. It's a very big place. You need to find a thing that you can rally around. And one of those things can be shown in a referendum. So in the Russian referendum, you're actually voting on things that you can't really vote on, because this is not a vote on a policy issue. It is a symbolic vote to find a way in which you can show that there is unity. So what do you do in this particular case? Now, when you were Hitler, you would find things that you could rally around, such as, in his case, having a Führer who could lead things. In Mussolini's case, that was the same. In Franco's case, they had a referendum in 1948 on whether there should be a monarchy after, which was about the unity of the state. Now, there wasn't support for any of these things throughout the country. It's interesting with the first Nazi referendum, actually voting was we actually have relatively good data for it, and there were actually elements of dissent that were shown there. But anyway, the essence of having a plebiscite in a dictatorship is to find things you can rally around. So what have the Russians done? What has Putin done? Well, one of the things which is on the ballot is that it's a historical question. Russia and only Russia won the Second World War. So the people are asked not on a policy question, they're asked to pronounce support for a contentious and obviously flawed historical conclusion or historical fact, contentious, to say at least, historical fact, that Russia and only Russia won the Second World War. It also says that Russia is a country under God. It's basically God's favourite. Now, God has not been consulted, I presume, but Putin is trying to use support for Christianity in Russia, which is increasing. It's a conservative kind of Christianity. He also wants to introduce a ban on LGBTQ rights, because that's also popular with the religious groups in Russia. So what he's trying to do here is to find things where he knows there is a consensus among certain parts of Russia, and then to use that to consolidate power. So it's not about a policy issue. It's not about even banning gay marriage or things like that, because that's pretty much out of the question anyway in Russia. Most people who are Christians in Russia believe that Russia is favoured particularly by God, but it is a way of getting some sort of legitimacy for his continued total control. So when we look at plebiscites around the world, then of course they're not fair. The result is very likely to be rigged, and it certainly will be in most cases. If you look around the world, there have been about 100 plebiscites in dictatorships, and only 2 of them have been lost. In most cases, they have followed and understood Stalin's dictum that whoever counts the votes is an important thing. Now, it is possible that a plebiscite like this can backfire. If you don't get a massive turnout, if you're not able to troop people to the polls, then you may be in trouble. In East Germany, where they also had a number of plebiscites, they would keep records of people who would go and vote. And if you didn't go to vote, then not only you, but your whole neighbourhood would suffer, and you wouldn't get money for the refurbishment of the communist-controlled flats and so on. So it's also a way of finding out who will go and vote. So you can control, in a very controlled state, especially in a totalitarian state, you can use the plebiscite as a way of finding out who are the possible oppositional people, the people who do not go to vote. But if everybody would go to vote, if you have complete control over the people who go and vote, then you also have complete control over the state. So another aspect of the plebiscite is that it is a mechanism of total control. It is a mechanism of finding out who the oppositional people are and of controlling these oppositional people. But the most fundamental thing is that it's a way of rallying people around popular issues. It gives sort of a veneer of legitimacy in a dictatorial state. Now, typically you have them at the beginning of a dictatorship, immediately when you come in, or you often have it right at the end. And the problem is, when you have it right at the end, is that you don't really control it. You take your eye off the ball. You don't really feel that there is opposition to you. And maybe you fail to control things you previously have controlled. That's what happened in Chile, in Latin America. Augusto Pinochet, who was the dictator there, had several referendums. One of the referendums, people were asked if they wanted to approve Christian civilization or as we know it, which most Chilean people wanted to do, of course. And in the last referendum, he wanted to have basically power forever, and there was the referendum on that particular issue. Pinochet said that if he didn't win, that would literally be the end of civilization as we knew it. And people wanted actually to vote for that. Now, Pinochet also, in addition to being a dictator, was somebody who was very much aware that the state was spending too much money. So he thought he could save money by having the votes counted locally rather than centrally. So instead of having the votes in Santiago, he had it out in different places, and The fact was that results then came in and he couldn't control the process and he lost. And that is what Putin has to watch out for. He might lose, or he may not lose outright, but the result might backfire. And that's not what he has been planning for.